Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Time Under Tension and our new series for 2024, Old to New, from Israelite to Disciple. And this week, we're going to be talking about Egypt. So, first
I'm
off,
pumped.
just as an intro, how was your first week of the year?
It was really good. I felt like our meeting was extremely helpful just to have that time on Sunday to sit and truly reflect on the week. I not only got to go back and see, how were we? How did we work through some of the challenges? How did we show up for each other? The gratitude moments, but it also just helped me run through the whole week. And I felt like what that did was it allowed me to go back and really remember the things that really worked and the things that didn't work and how to go about changing some of the maybe the scheduling or, the when to do what and also just noticing what patterns I really stuck to. Like my meditation practice has is like my number one priority in the year. I mentioned a ton of the goals that I had, but my stillness practice, I feel like, is the one practice that I'm not willing to sacrifice. It is something that regardless of how I feel, I'm going to do that. And so to stick to that and be really filled with a lot of wisdom and a time of transition and hopefulness and renewal, it was a good week. I felt very fulfilled after the week. How about you?
That's great. I feel the same. I think I love setting the big goals, but one thing I've learned more and more over time, and I've been working on enforcing this more with clients, is like initially when you set big goals, you're saying this is where I am and like this is where I ideally want to be, but there's this gap in between and there's this process of like building out to that. You're not going to go from not having any habits to having a whole set of new habits. Like if you're wanting to implement new things, that first phase is going to take going into it and realizing, okay, this habit keeps falling off for me reading, like reading keeps falling off. My old tendency would be like, well, I've already missed the first, however many days of the year, or I only got 3 days this week. So like, screw it. Maybe this goal is just not a good one for me. But instead, I'm like, through our conversation and through the way that I'm tracking it with my just lovely little check-in sheet, I feel like I'm seeing more about the frequency. I'm like, okay, like I got it in 3 times. Well, guess what? That was 3 times more than every week in the
Right.
entire year before. So instead, it's like that
Mhm.
empowerment piece of like, oh, what did go well this week? It went well that I did read 3 times, but also what are some things I can do to make sure that that's a habit that doesn't fall off? And when it's a new one, it's going to take more than just saying like, it needs to happen in the day. So we got to like talk about that together. Like, what would that look like to make that more of like a consistent habit? Because just saying I want to do it isn't enough to make it happen. I got to make sure that I'm scheduling it and setting an intention about the time for it. But that's all a learning process. So I think it's really cool to go in. And I think the piece that's been missing for me in the past is like having a check in process because a year is a huge amount of time. But saying all I have to do is one, today, I have a checklist for today, but then a weekly
Right.
review is pretty easy to say, like, okay, now I can course correct. Okay, now I course correct. And if every week you're course correcting, man, your life is going to change rapidly. Rapidly. And
Definitely.
it doesn't have to be like all at once. So I really like that process. It makes me also very hopeful for the changes and just the development.
I actually think kind of a cool segue into the topic we're talking about today is, the verse of the day today was forgetting the former things and seeing the new thing that God's doing. And I think that's going to speak more to that desert topic that we'll talk about. But I find that there are still some times where I'm noticing that there are pieces of my Egypt stuck inside of my mind. And in regards to trying to stick to every single day, I'm going to do these things, tendencies around old thought patterns or beliefs about myself tend to surface occasionally. And something that you mentioned there that really helped me kind of tie those two things together is that what you're believing is really what you're becoming. And I think when you have these deeper beliefs and you have these um, thoughts of lack or poverty in whatever area that is, not necessarily money, but in general, when you think you're lacking something and all of a sudden goal setting or another person or relationships or your job or something else becomes this definer of who you are, this identification with fear in these areas of worrying of some sort of judgment or worrying about not being enough or worrying about um, not being someone you're striving to be and then having that be something you're taking on as an identity almost removes the capacity for change, and it removes the capacity to actually see a new perspective or a new way to get curious about the particular thing you're struggling with. So the reason I tied that to Egypt is I think as I'm studying it this morning and listening to more of the archaeological approach to it, like some of the artifacts in the text that they're finding about that period of time and the Pharaoh during the Exodus and what that was like, a lot of it stemmed around this this viewpoint of lacking in this ideation of survival and not thriving or not having some sort of faith in something greater or good. And that was just a brief little point I wanted to throw in there before we kind of got started. And curious your thoughts on that if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I've looked into this a little bit as well, but I think you've done more of like the historical digging. So I'd love to hear your insight just based on what you've learned. But I think it really helps to have that context because, if you've grown up listening to this story or you have heard this before, there's like a certain perspective that you have just based on what we read, but to actually understand what's going on historically, I think is helpful. And then it gives us more to compare to when we look at how this story actually like parallels in our own spiritual journey, which is really, I feel like what we're trying to do with this. Like there is this
Right.
historical story that is helpful to know like where we come from, but also what does this mean when we look at our own journey and relationship with God?
I think one of the biggest things to note here is we're definitely taking the concept of Egypt and the concept of the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt and taking that and modernizing it, I think, to our own personal testimonies with God and sharing how this idea, the Holy Spirit's kind of given us this different lens on how we're seeing it show up not only in our clients, but in ourselves and in the world around us. So I just want to preface like this is the scriptural meaning of this time. This is not really that's not really where we're going with this. More about how can we take this concept of the Israelites being enslaved to Egypt under this authoritarian power that's, prioritizing fear to instill this obedience across this, demographic of individuals, this suppression of a particular group of people, and understand how that can actually be an inner world experience inside of your own body and inside of your own mind in the world around us. So it's more about the relationship between the two and how that still shows up, even though we do have free will. And most obviously, like some people are absolutely struggling with um, poverty in general, like actually being homeless. And we see that a ton in Arizona. There are things that are very true for some people that replicate very much what this looks like. But this in our session, I just want to be super clear. This is way more about how we are taking it and applying it to not only, again, our testimony, but what we've noticed in clients we've worked with, or just what we see in the world around us.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's super important. Like we're not theologians.
Yeah.
We both spend time in the Bible, but that's
Right.
not the purpose of
Yeah.
this. So there's a lot of like openness to interpretation here, but just more about like, how it applies in our lives, how we see it, and maybe there's a helpful parallel there for your own life and you can start to think about as you listen, what is your Egypt? Was that a previous time in your life, or do you feel like you're in that now? Really start to reflect on that, and we'd love to, hear your thoughts as you kind of compare this to your own story.
Definitely. Do you want to go ahead and start with maybe sharing your personal Egypts in your own life? And then also maybe coupling that with how are you viewing this concept of the Egypt and the Israelites in the world around us today?
Yeah. So I'm such a context person. I feel like I have to go back a little bit. So before the Israelites ended up in Egypt, we go back to like Abraham, and there was like a promise that God gave to Abraham about giving him children as many as the stars. And this promise is something that the Israelites held on to thereafter, knowing that they were God's like covenant people who he had made this promise to. And so over time, throughout the generations, um, through Joseph's story, the Israelites ended up in Egypt, and it started out like amicably with like the Pharaoh like inviting them to come and share the land and like join, be open to worshiping their God, but in this land of Egypt. And then we read last night, like 200 plus years, it changed. The dynamic shifted, and it became a hierarchy of the Egyptians putting the Israelites into slavery and using them for slave labor, and even getting to the point of killing their male children because they were fearful of the Israelites like growing and becoming more of a threat. But throughout that time, like the Israelites, I imagine, were probably very disheartened, but the ones who remained faithful, like they knew that there was this promise. So when I think about like my own story and how that parallels, I've had a relationship with God very young. Like I had parents who at least talked about God a lot. My mom has a deep relationship with God. My grandparents do. And so I grew up in the church and feeling like I really like knew God deeply. And then and with that came this promise of like everything that I had heard about who God is and what he does and what he promises us and that he's working all things for our good. I believed that promise. And then there came a time in my life where I started turning to the world around me for fulfillment. And to me that is Egypt. Is like, okay, I'm in this strange land, and it's kind of like providing for me, like it's giving me what I need. It's like putting food on my table. It's giving me work every day. Like my home is here, but like you said, it's survival, not thriving. Like I'm going to different aspects of this culture. For me, my eating disorder, like maybe this will help me feel a sense of control if I turn to this aspect of the culture. Or eventually I felt like what I really called Egypt was my experience in Dallas when I was deep in bodybuilding, and it felt like, oh, I feel like I'm at the top of the world. Like Egypt is a huge like mecca of development and culture, and there's so much promise there, and they're building pyramids, and they're just like demonstrating their power in all ways and dominating other nations, right? And it's like an abundant land with these rivers. Like there's so much about it that seems so delightful, but then in it's so like empty, and there was so much demand from the land of like, oh well, if you want to live here and partake of this, here's what's going to be expected of you. And when I was in bodybuilding, it wasn't all a bad thing, but I think that's part of the challenge. If it just all sucked, it wouldn't be so hard to like leave. But it's like it's also kind of giving me what I need, so I'm wanting validation, I'm wanting love. And so I'm kind of getting that. It feels a little bit watered down and like not always super genuine, but like it's giving me those hits of things that I want. And I get attention, and I get, people, pursue me physically, or they even try to start a relationship with me. Like that alone was satisfying me and like validating. It gave me a sense of validation. And then,
Hmm.
as everything it felt like it was getting bigger and bigger. I got my pro card, and then I get signed as an athlete, and like all of those things, each one felt like, oh, yes, like, yes, now I have this, now I have this. But what I started seeing is as I got to each level, I'm like looking at the people around me like, okay, we're all here in this place, and this is like elite status, and the people who aren't like on our level as we saw it then, like they are looking up to this place that we're in, but like no one on this level is happy. Like everyone's like really dissatisfied and like constantly striving and like never feeling fulfilled and never feeling appreciated. And there's so much drug use and there's so much sleeping around, and like relationships are being ruined all around me, and no one's happy with their bodies, and everyone's health is declining. And like it was just kind of this weird, like there's all this toxic stuff going on that no one's willing to acknowledge, including myself, because I'm like, but it also like is meeting my needs. And so it was really hard to kind of see, like I'm like in the water, like I'm a fish in the water and I can't really see the water around me, but I'm just telling that like it's unsettling and it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like it's the fulfillment of that promise of God. Like I thought it was, but it was like masked as something else.
Could you speak to maybe if there was fear present around leaving the space, around choosing something different that could potentially bring happiness? You know, you're talking about how it's meeting your needs and you're in survival mode, but can you talk more about, because you're in that place and you're so embedded in it that it's surrounding you on all sides, you know, what was there an option in your mind to leave? And if that were to present itself in your mind, maybe how you were going about in your relationship to the fear or to the worry or to the anxiousness or just the unknown. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, in my mind, there wasn't an out. I mean, I lived in that culture. And so it got to the point where like every conversation I'm having is, when's your next show? You know, what are you lifting? What's your split? All this stuff. It was like everything about me was bodybuilding. It felt like, with that, the people that I was around in that environment. And so it was really challenging because my identity became so wrapped up in that culture that I started to lose a sense of my identity in anything else. It didn't even seem like there was an option to not be doing it. And I didn't really have awareness of my desire to not be doing it. I just kind of thought, well, maybe if I make it to the next level, maybe if I make it to the next level or get the next sponsorship or whatever, then I'll feel fulfilled. Then this won't feel so like empty.
Could you speak also to your relationship to God over the course of this time? Maybe speaking from, you know, hey, you had this loving family and God was very much a part of the conversation and you're, you know, Abraham, Joseph, like you're filled with people around having these conversations about Yahweh, you know, that's when it's reference for the first time in that space. How that then that relationship to God, or maybe it's God's prominence in your thoughts and in your heart as you are progressing towards being more in this Egypt space, more not really necessarily the intro into Egypt, because maybe there was this sense of like gratitude for having this capacity to enter into lifting. I know you've spoken a lot to like this was something that actually also gave you this confidence, you know, it gave you something that you're passionate about and that you love. And so maybe speaking to how it went from something you were just doing to truly move your body to how it started to become this thing, and when your relationship to God maybe shifted or changed in that space.
Yeah, I think it shifted before that. I think when I started turning to things other than God for fulfillment, which was probably more around high school, with the start of my eating disorder, and starting to look to relationships for fulfillment, and I started getting into bodybuilding. So I thought my body image would give me that fulfillment. I think over time, I just kind of started to assume that I believed that God was real, but I started to see his relationship as very disconnected from me. Like maybe he just kind of planted us here, but isn't very involved. Or maybe he's just involved with the people who are not sinning. Because I started to do behaviors that I felt like just disqualified me from like even asking him for anything. So like,
Mm,
well, if I can't really ask God for anything in my life because like I can't even approach him, then I guess I'm just going to do this on my own. And I trust that he's there. Like I believe that. So like that's like somewhat comforting, but I don't feel like I can invite him into this space because I have so much shame around the choices that I'm making that I can't even approach him. And I was always told that in prayer, the first thing you need to do is come to him with your sins and like apologize and repent for what you've done. And I'm like, I can't even get anywhere other than that in prayer because it starts getting so freaking long at that point that I'm just like, well, now I feel like crap because I'm just sitting here like, well, let me drop the list of like
yeah,
25 things I need to apologize for. So I think it started earlier than that. And then it was just perpetuated in that state. And then I think being in that culture, that Egypt, there was this like, work hard, like you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like self-made, all this stuff. And there's a dark and a light side to everything. I can see how that's beneficial. Like it's helpful. Hard work is good. Discipline is a good thing. But like when you start to get in that mindset of like, I built myself up from the ground and like no one helped me. And it's a very like independent kind of sport. There's just that mindset where you're not really like giving credit to anyone else. You're like taking credit for like every pound of muscle you've put on your body, like every meal you've eaten perfectly. Like there's just so much weight on your like performance in that space.
definitely. And I think what we'll do, just as a side note here, is we're really speaking in this episode about our Egypts and about the Egypt that we're seeing in the world. So this can seem really challenging of a conversation, I think, and it can be very like hard to be reflecting in your own personal life on how you're allowing the things the world places as important or are what going is going to lead to fulfillment and peace and joy, like your appearance and relationships outside of God and things like money and power and status and things of this nature. But as we progress through the episodes, we'll talk about that desert season of actually leaving this space and taking that risk of faith and then being able to actually enter, baptism and then that discipleship aspect of like walking with God and how Egypt actually served as the most prominent experience that actually leads to discipleship. So I just want to throw that in there because this conversation's we're going to be talking about our challenges and our struggles and the things of the world that can really cause us to fall into these spaces of being enslaved to things that don't actually lead to true fulfillment, this illusion. And I want everybody to know, stay with us, stay in it, take this time to reflect, but also know we will absolutely cover why this is absolutely necessary of a season to truly enter into this deep relationship of faith with God. So I didn't mean to like pump the brakes there, but I think it's really important we drop that in there because we can really start to get into like shame and guilt and
Mm-hmm.
fear and like uncertainty of like, well, if this isn't life truly, like I'm actually just trying to survive and I'm not truly alive inside, there's almost this challenge of hopefulness and you start to really experience despair and apathy. And so as you're transitioning through your reflection time of really thinking about the things that obviously Olivia is sharing some of hers now and I'll share some of mine, but always know that that is absolutely the point in time where you realize that there is choice and you can choose faith and you can choose a journey that's going to lead you to true life within this fulfillment, this peace, this joy, this capacity to truly thrive and feel this abundance and not feel attached to anything outside of yourself.
Definitely. And I think like we all go through this in some capacity. Even the Christians I've
For
known
sure.
who have been like deep in their faith forever have gone through seasons of turning away from God and turning to other things for fulfillment. And like the prodigal son, I think that sometimes it necessitates those periods of time where it's like, I have to be able to go out and see what else is out there to be able to recognize like the depth of fulfillment that I get in that love for God. And maybe it's not as dramatic as some of these things that we're talking about. And I think that as well, like this isn't about comparing to your own journey in any way. You may feel like, oh, I've done way worse things, or well, I haven't really felt like I've had that season at all. But it's not really about the specific things, it's about the intentions of your heart. And I would say overarching theme in this Egypt season for myself was that I was looking to all of these things other than God for fulfillment. These things are not necessarily like good or bad of themselves. There was a lot of good in it all, but when my intention became this will fulfill me, this will solidify my identity, this will provide my like salvation and lock it in for me in this world, that's when it became something other than what it should have been.
For sure. I love that scripture that says that when God is, it's in the Old Testament scripture, and God is saying, like, you're idolizing things that aren't even alive. You're worshiping food, or you're worshiping statues, or you're worshiping whatever that is in the real world, money and status and power and appearance, and having the relationship or having the family or having the ideal life that we've portrayed as this representation of joy and fulfillment or goodness in life. And when you really think about that, it's really interesting to kind of reflect on that, because when I think about my personal Egypt journeys, when I read that, I was like, I really am relying on things that are so temporary and also don't have the capacity to truly lift me up, or speak to me or give me wisdom or allow for this intimate connection of something that's going to continue to progress me through this world with actual substance. Like there's no breath in those
Mm.
things. And so that was a really cool thing for me to read and realize and reflect on as I was going through my desert season. So maybe that's for the desert section. But something I want to twist all the way back, or maybe like come back to, that you mentioned was, the pre-context. And something I wanted to add in there is like, when I was listening to some of these archaeological approaches to the context of the time, they speak to this specific pharaoh being the first pharaoh that didn't necessarily acknowledge Joseph or remember Joseph. So when the Israelites are coming into Egypt initially, there is this abundance. There's this, you see in their lifespan of like the bones of these people's bodies, their bones aren't as like um I want to say frizzled, but that's not the right word. Like their ligaments and their bones weren't as broken down as they were in the second half. Like once this new pharaoh entered into rulership, he was following what was who was seen as the greatest pharaoh of the time, meaning the most conquered, the most victorious, the one who went and conquered all this additional land for Egypt. And this was his son. And so he didn't know Joseph or really even acknowledge that idea of love and companionship and working together with one another. And enslavement in Joseph's time, or in the law of God, actually speaks to like treating your masters and servants, having this relationship with each other that is fruitful and healthy and kind, and you're taking care of one another. It's not this idea that we see in the modern world, or that we saw obviously previously in our history when slavery became a very real thing in a completely different manner, like total power dynamic, total almost less than a whole human type of treatment towards people. So when we experience that in our history and see that these people went from living these longer, healthy lives to now you're seeing in these archaeological approaches to this time period, you're seeing piles of people's bones that are frail and not living past 30, and there's clearly no life that was able to be lived here. There was fear and brutality and just this complete power of this pharaoh of asserting himself onto, as you mentioned before, these people who were a potential threat to him and what he was hoping to achieve in his power. So he started getting rid of even other potential idols. That there's a woman of healing, this statue, this idea of peace and serenity and harmony with each other. He's knocking those idols down for people. It's just completely taking over in this way that's creating this workforce type in the modern world experience where people are just forced into manual labor all day long with very little pay and very little food and maltreatment and punishment for no reason and all these things that we're now talking about in the Exodus, which again, just referencing a little bit more of the history there, but it began with this concept of poverty. And what I love so much about, if I were to just think of the world today, and I talk about this pretty passionately, is I feel like what's happened, in my own opinion, is our structure has created these classes of people, and we're now seeing this highest class as where we need to be to thrive. We have to get to that place. We have to have this money. We have to have this status and this power. Otherwise, we're going to end up in the lower or middle class where we're having to just work our ass off all day and not truly be able to live the life that we would want, which in our eyes is this elaborate experience. Like I got the boat and I got the house and I got unlimited funds, abundance of money, and that's going to make me feel fulfilled. And what ended up happening is, in that time, obviously, I think it was happening way earlier in the Bible as well, but people started to see other people as the threat to thriving or survival. Other people, I'm now competing against other people to reach this safety that's going to allow me to feel okay and that I'm complete and whole and good. And it started turning into these things like, if you don't have money, then God clearly doesn't care for you, or you're not living in the right way, your righteous way, because clearly, if you look at what you have, your materials, you're not doing the things that are supporting and abundant God's thankfulness for your service, for example. And so my point in sharing all of that is, if we look at our world today, I think one of the biggest struggles that we have in all of this is that we are trying to fight for power and status, and we're seeing each other as the barrier to reaching safety, when really safety is an inner experience. It's something that when we can rely on the creator of the world, when we can rely on God, who is almighty and all sovereign and has full control anyway, once we can surrender that to him, we start to be able to live in love and not live in fear. And so the reason I share all of that is I think that's kind of the journey that I hope that we can describe here is, fulfillment is not going to come with power, status, and money. Power in the government structure of power, not like inner Holy Spirit power or inner empowerment through baptism or through just being willing to let God use you as an empty vessel. I think it speaks a lot to the power God can give people. I think that misalignment of our culture, and then on top of that, the media just constantly pumping fear into our minds, it just gets you in this survival state. And so now all of a sudden, Egypt is essentially our world because we're seeing power, status, and money as the things that we need, stuff, things outside of ourselves, materialistic things that won't have value at some point, as what we need to reach safety or thrive. And so then if you think about that, you really are enslaved. You're enslaved to these beliefs that you're lacking something. And if you're feeling a sense of lack, then you actually don't have the capacity to experience that inner power of thriving, because your nervous system is completely in fight or flight constantly. We've all experienced trauma. And so trauma is just this other aspect of these things outside of me, the world is not safe. And so if you, even that, even trauma, that's the work that I do, is let's start to really uproot your trauma. Let's unlearn and relearn with these positive corrective experiences, because once you can truly see that the trauma you've experienced in your life is not a reflection of you being bad, it's just keeping you enslaved. It's keeping you from freedom. It's keeping you stuck in these patterns of behavior that are creating this dysregulated experience inside of your body, that it's just the total opposite of purpose. It's the total opposite of having true freedom. It's the total opposite of having a God that's full of faith and love and joy, all these things, right? Actual safety in connection, safety in the world, not needing anything outside of yourself in our this journey of our life. So that was a mouthful, but as I start to get back into my personal experience of my Egypts, it's just that. It's that idea that when you are dwelling in your mind in worry or in fear or in anxiety or in your future, or you're dwelling on your past, or you're dwelling on these experiences, even subconsciously, you can have this experience. Whatever you're dwelling in or on is going to create the inner state within your body. And it's going to create how you're feeling towards all of these perceptions that you have on the world. So, in my experience, I didn't grow up in a home that was talking about God or faith. It was perform, 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 high performance. You're an athlete. I was really athletic and really good, really young. So I got very much into this mental belief system deep down that my performance what made me worthy. My performance, performing at the highest high level and performing really well equaled safety to me. So outside of having that God like figure in my life, I was seeing high performance. I was seeing, I was getting attention for my looks. I had the appearance, I had the body. All of these things then became my innate makeup inside of what's going to keep me safe. As I progressed through my life, the fruit of my life was infidelity, consistently in a relationship, thinking another person was the only way I was going to feel fulfilled or safe. My performance was 100% going to be the thing that kept me safe from judgment and from, how do I even want to word this? If I didn't perform well, I was so uncertain as to what was going to happen in a multitude of areas that it would cause panic. And I obviously was pretty blessed with my performance pretty consistently, but because of that, it just kept me stuck in this mindset of I am always every single day having to get up and work so hard and do all of these things to reach any sort of level of safety that wasn't even sustained into the next day, let alone the next hour. Each moment in a volleyball match, I'm like, gotta perform, gotta perform, gotta perform, 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 just stuck in it, totally enslaved to performance. I couldn't even be as a person. And what that led me to was a nervous system that no longer understood parasympathetic activation or rest and digest. I put my body to such a state of exhaustion that now I'm having to have hormone replacement therapy at 28. I am still having to weed out some of these thoughts of my performance is going to keep you around in my relationship, or I can't make a mistake in the workplace because that could potentially lead to, in my mind, if I play out the tape, I get fired, no one respects me, I then don't have this job. Now I'm actually not as good at this as this thing that I thought that I was good at, and now all of a sudden I'm left without love, and now what's the point? Like that feels like death. And so you can kind of do that exercise too, like play it out. Like, what's the fear in your mind? And then actually figure out what the root cause of that is and be able to address that there. And then obviously, with my appearance growing up, food became something I manipulated and worshiped. If I could go and work out for 3 hours in the day and then make sure I controlled my eating, I would always have the body. That way I'd be okay. And like I would always have at least somebody wanting my attention or loving me, wanting to love me for my external experience. Obviously, just as you spoke to, and how anyone who's had an eating disorder, if this doesn't just trigger the word Egypt in your mind, it's so um it is such a an enslaved experience of this world when you wake up and you have so much anxiousness about even going out and connecting with other people. I'm gonna have to pack my food. Like, well, what if this ruins my schedule? Like, you're so routine, there's no flow, you're so rigid, and everything that's coming into your perception of your mind or your eyes is coming in and then analyzing its data in your body, and all of a sudden anything to do with food is triggering you in this way. And if you think about that, you're really not free. To me, Egypt is this reflection of, it has its thumb on your throat, and you cannot for the life of you separate yourself from this particular way of life or this belief system and then you're stuck living in that pattern. You're stuck in that enslaved experience. That's that state of survival. And then you're never able to access that true experience of the fact that you have breath and the fact that you're just here as a person means that you have purpose and means that you can go about this life co-creating, and you can have curiosity and imagination and wonder and awe, and you have these emotions that are attached to thriving and not surviving, and you realize just how much you're living in fear of what the world has said is going to keep you safe, when really nothing that the world is saying will keep you safe is actually going to keep you safe inside your body. You'll consistently be on this hamster wheel, going nowhere, chasing these things that are inevitably going to just lead you back to the same place of your realization that this isn't working. These things that I'm choosing to idolize, these things that I'm choosing to put myself through every day is actually getting me nowhere closer to true freedom and true fulfillment inside.
Oh my gosh, so many great things there. I think some of the things that really stood out were just that thought of, I love what you said about the fruit of your life, like when you were living in Egypt, the fruit of your life was not good. It wasn't good fruit. And I think if you're
Totally.
thinking about this yourself right now, like you guys are reflecting on what we're talking about, maybe thinking about how it's in your own life, like look in the areas of your life that don't feel like very fruitful. And that may be a key to finding a root in Egypt. And I think also Egypt, we're talking about Egypt like it's a one stage of life, but I think that there's kind of pieces of it that we work on throughout our life. We're never just like, we never just like completely step out of that and then move forward and like don't ever deal with any of that ever again. Like we're built, our life is a story. And so the story is parts that play into the next part that play into the next part, and there's threads of what we've been through throughout our lives. And I think there is like true healing and restoration and renewal in our lives. Like I think that's what coming to Christ truly is, but we are still existing in the flesh where there will be pieces of that. Like
Mm.
even now, I don't feel like I actively struggle with an eating disorder, but even in August, I start prepping for a jujitsu competition and I start slipping into those patterns again. And I start to believe, oh, I like the way this feels. I like the way it looks. I want to post the way I look, post my body a little bit more. All this stuff starts coming up again. It's like, there's Egypt. Now I can notice it a lot better because I've been there and I know where that goes, but also because I have an amazing partner who can be like, that's Egypt. Hey, like that's not what's gonna fulfill you. Um, but just like no, it's not about like you're never gonna deal with any of these things ever again. But the goal is to start to recognize these things that you're looking for fulfillment in are so empty. And what you said about it, like really keeping you enslaved, reminded me of like the second Peter 2:19, where a man is a slave to anything that has mastered him. And so anything that we think
Mm,
that we have to be fulfilled,
for sure.
we are then enslaved to. And in Buddhism, they say like desire is the root of suffering. Like when we want something, now we're suffering because we think that we have to have that thing in order to reach fulfillment. Whereas the strange paradox of coming to Christ, I feel, is like you're already enough. And that may feel unsettling because you can look external and say, but this and this and this, and like, why don't I just feel like an abundant sense of peace? But I think the goal is to that the more you start to believe that you already have everything that you need and you don't have to go to these things
Mhm,
outside of you, and all you have to do, all meaning it's simple, it's not always easy, but all you have to do is come to God for that sense of fulfillment, for that direction. And he's a kind father. He's not a slave driver who is like, all right, well, if you're going to look for fulfillment in this culture, here's the law of the land. And there's going to be a lot of demands on you that are going to compromise your character along the way.
for sure. I think one of the things that I wanna make sure I solidify just from what I said as well is One of the things that has really allowed when Egypt moments tend to show up in my life is this reminder that I do have free will and I have choice. Now, with that, I think that has become a product of the inner work that I've done, especially around uprooting my trauma, because it's it's actually not always something certain individuals have due to their trauma. It puts you in such a nervous system response state of freeze when you have had a really, really serious trauma in your life that sometimes there really isn't this capacity for choice because you're so frozen. And so I do want to touch on that a little bit because we are not our trauma. We are not our feelings. We are not our thoughts, and we are not our emotions. All of those things have happened to us or are a product of our experiences in the past, but that is not who we are at our core. And that initial belief of believing wholeheartedly that your identity is spirit, you are a child of God, or your identification with the fact that you're spirit like, you're not your physical body, you're not what's happened to your physical body or your emotional body or your mental body. Those are all aspects of who you are. And we have parts inside that are created after trauma happens to us. But that initial identification with spirit as your spiritual self allows you to create this relationship with your parts and relationship to your trauma, to your body, to your emotional body, to your mental body, that allows you to be with your parts in these moments of being triggered, when you're in these experiences that bring you back to a past memory or even that some of that fear of the future. Getting into the present moment is extremely, extremely important because that's where you truly can experience the fact that you lack nothing. That initial, I think Egypt's biggest tactic in not only in when it speaks to the Israelites, but in our current world today is this idea that we are lacking something, that we don't have everything that we need, that we're not good enough until we're here, or that we're lacking money or we're lacking something to allow us to feel safe, which I keep saying feel safe. That's really just knowing wholeheartedly that you can surrender to every moment. That's because God already has this whole thing figured out for you. Again, we do have choice though, and that's where co-creating comes in. And I think what's so cool about God is he gives us free will, he gives us choice. So when we are in those moments of, okay, all that I've known is that I need to stay in this job because if I were to think about leaving this job to go to some other job or explore starting my own business, I could be left without any money. I could be on the streets. I might not be able to provide for my family. There's always going to be these numerous amounts of things that come up from a fear perspective, this fear lens, because of the culture we've lived in. That's not meaning you're bad. It just means this is the culture we've grown up in. This is what we know to be true, that we have to be willing to understand that that choice in that moment is the difference between certainty, which is your lukewarm life of the job that you hate, and having unwavering faith to truly understand that there's something inside you that God's placed in you with purpose that is going to take you leaving and stepping out in uncertainty, building that relationship to surrender, and just knowing what the next right step is in the present moment. Not that you can't create vision, but that even to create vision and imagine and have these ideas that are so exciting and empowering, knowing you have everything that you need, if you have God and you have this deep, intimate relationship, all of a sudden you're starting to experience the world in a more colorful way. You're starting to understand that literally your money could be gone tomorrow for any other reason outside of your job as well. Anything can happen. And so understanding the deepest level of truth in that everything is uncertain. Like to be real, like nothing's in our control, to be like quite honest. Where we do have control is in our choosing of the thoughts that we're going to hold as truth and the choices that we make in our habits, the choices we're making in our belief systems, the choices we're making in our relationships to all things, that's where we have some power to integrate the fact that we are choosing thriving. We're choosing to not no longer stay in Egypt. These patterns of behavior that clearly aren't leading to our lives improving at all. We're still on the antidepressant medicine. We're still on the anti-anxiety medicine. We're still feeling extremely unfulfilled, even though we have the partner, all of these things that we're realizing in our lives. You have to take that and not experience that as this the world is ending. It's just a realization that these things truly aren't going to be the things that lead to this wholeness. We already are whole and can live out of that wholeness with love. So I think I just wanted to throw that in there because the truth is trauma can sometimes take away choice when it gets our nervous system so frozen. But as you start to do your inner work, you start to explore what your trauma is rooted in, you can unlearn and relearn, and that's going to allow you to have choice in each moment to decide if you're going to fall into fear and live in survival mode, or you're going to choose love and expansion and growth and spiritual empowerment and actually start to thrive in this world.
Definitely. And I think that's a really good segue into what we're going to be talking about next week with the desert, because I do feel like with that, there's this moment of God then calling them out of Egypt. And that's when they have to face that sense of uncertainty that you're saying. And maybe that becomes
Yeah.
more tangible. And suddenly this thing that has been very uncertain, really, they're living in this environment in which they're enslaved, and then Pharaoh's like killing their children. Like that happened all at once. There is so much uncertainty there, but it's like you said earlier, the devil, like it's like, oh, well, like we kind of know what this is like. So there's this weird sense of certainty there, even though you really don't have any control in that space. To are you willing to take the step that may seem more uncertain, but is rooted in a God that is the most certain thing that there could possibly be in this world. So I think that would be that's something we'll kind of go into next week when we talk about that transition out of Egypt into the desert.
Perfect. I love it. Cut off.
Cut off. I know we can go into this forever, and
Awesome.
I think the tie to trauma is really such a great point with all of this and that sense of safety, because when we are living in that fear state, like it's really hard to see anything else. But to actually be able to come out of that and see that there is a different reality in front of you. Like you could be in the same environment technically, but start to look at it through a different value system that allows you to
Yeah.
move forward in that space and find that sense of peace, not because of what's in the external environment, but because you're no longer looking to that for fulfillment.
My last drop, and then we can cut it off. We cannot do this work alone either. So, yes, your relationship with God is absolutely the most important thing, but build a community, go see a therapist, go get a life coach, get trauma informed, start to educate yourself around people who are going to create a very positive co-regulation experience for you, because we really can't create these corrective experiences with just ourselves. Really try to understand if isolation is something you struggle with, we need other people. We need other people. And so back to the very original point, we're not competing against one another. We're really here to love each other and help each other come into this true healing experience of love and thriving. So please, 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 like reach out to one of us too, or find somebody in your immediate environment that you can reach out, talk to, start to do some of this work around. Mine was with Mastin Kip when I got certified in it. So any resources he has, absolutely excellent. Um, but just don't think that this is something that either one of us have done by ourselves. We've both been in therapy. I have a life coach. Liv's done her inner work and done her experiences with her coaches as well. And there's definitely, definitely, definitely a need for each other to be able to heal and to conquer Egypt. You can't do it on your own. So please find a community and get involved in some sort of support group, or doing some of those other modalities like EMDR or breathwork journeys or somatic breathwork healing or any of those things, IFS, stuff like that. Just start looking at your resources and be able to really do that work with people who are going to help you heal in that space.
Definitely. I think that's so, so valuable. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening. As always, feel free to reach out to us. If you're not sure where to start with those resources that Dee mentioned, definitely feel free to reach out. We can connect you with things that have helped us, and how to even go about, finding a therapist or someone like a life coach you can work with. Hint, hint, Dee is life coach. But join us next
Bring it on,
week.
y'all.
Join us next week where we're going to go into then part 2 of this series, which is the desert. I'm really excited about that. And please remember to like, subscribe, follow, and comment below, and reach out to us if you have any questions. And we will catch you guys next time on Time Under Tension.